Your retirement account may be quietly funding the very industries you'd never write a personal check to support. The average diversified portfolio owns slivers of businesses whose profits flow from addiction, exploitation, and the destruction of human life, often without the owner ever knowing it. Today, we're going to walk through how to build a portfolio that takes seriously the truth that God owns it all and that we are stewards, not silent partners in ill-gotten gain. So Spencer, again, today we're going to continue our conversation about how to construct, how to think about our portfolios from those terms of how to avoid ill-gotten gain and be stewards of these resources that God has placed in our hands. We are managers on His behalf. So we think about how do we actually craft a portfolio. So let's come back to this idea of why stewards should care about what they own in their portfolios.
Well, we could go to a lot of different scripture here, but one would be certainly Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. That's pretty far encompassing. We also look at a passage like Deuteronomy 23 that talks about how the Lord does not want the wages of the prostitute brought in and presented in the temple because it's ill-gotten gain. So we look at that, and of course that's continued in the New Testament, a number of different passages, but in Ephesians 5, Paul says, have nothing to do with fruitless deeds of darkness. So many different passages we could go to, but basically there's this idea that there is gain that is derived from good things, or at least delivering some level of value that would not be antithetical to God's purposes. And then there is profiting or gain that is derived from those purposes that would be counter to His, and sometimes very, very much counter to His. I think that's where we have to all grapple and say, okay, this is what I believe that I'm called to and comfortable with, and then there's always some gray area in there. So I think last time we talked a little bit about whether you could get behind, Coca-Cola, for instance, or snack food or something like that. Maybe it's not the greatest for all of us, but it's not, completely a destruction of life in the way that some other industries would be.
Right. And I think the reality here is we are, as we talked about in the last episode, if you own a public stock or any sort of public equity or private equity, you own a sliver of that company. And so as the company succeeds, as they thrive, you both want to be able to cheer for them, but also the profits that they are deriving. Those are what is coming back into your retirement account. And oftentimes, we've wrestled with this personally of how much is it generating? And then is it really that bad to profit from it if I choose to then deploy it in good causes? And I think that nuance is something we do have to wrestle with because, again, coming back to that Deuteronomy passage where it says, do not bring the tithe of the prostitute into the storehouse. God does not want us generating profit from ill-gotten gain. And so if He calls us not to profit from ill-gotten gain, we should do our best to avoid ill-gotten gain in our portfolio. When we look at kind of the landscape of investing, obviously there are some avenues where it's much easier to avoid ill-gotten gain, and some avenues where it's actually very difficult to avoid ill-gotten gain. So we're not going to go into all the nuance and the complexity of, well, my 401k doesn't have biblically responsible funds, my IRA does, should I do this, should I do that? Those are things we're going to say wrestle with over time with the Lord. But as we think about how do we actually categorize some of this, how are we starting to think about the different areas that investors could choose to screen out?
Well, again, provided that you have the capacity to screen out. To your point, a 401k sometimes might only have 8 funds, available to it. And so you have to grapple with, do I want to, put in resources, get a match on those resources, have much more to deploy down the road and have maybe a small amount that is running antithetical to, what you would hope for, or do you avoid it altogether? I think that's a tough question. But as we talk about it today, what we're really getting into is those areas, and we would categorize them kind of 3 ways here of most faith-driven investors either screening out or at least very much grappling with. So the first would be the classic sin stocks, that you would hear about. This would be anything that really the purpose of the company, you could say, is to ensnare or enslave even people in addiction. So you think about tobacco, gambling, adult entertainment, alcohol, these kind of classic areas that you've had some investors avoid for not just decades, but really centuries, in some ways. Going back to the old Quakers and Methodists that said, we're not going to have anything in holdings that would be alongside those arenas. So again, people might have different opinions about a few of those. Maybe you're not as focused on alcohol, for instance. We've talked about this a little bit, but really, I think there's a good reason that you think about screening out alcohol driven companies, in your portfolio. And that's because, at least a British study, and I presume that, Britain's not the only country that sees its people going in this direction, but about 2/3 of all profits from alcohol companies in Britain came from those who were drinking heavily or were addicted to alcohol. So we look at that and say, this isn't just, a company that's making a little bit of profit on someone that drinks, every now and then on the weekend or something like that. Most of their profits are being derived by the folks that from the folks that are engaging that too frequently.
Right. Well, and we think about tobacco companies where in the United States, there's a significant amount of regulation. The moment that you move overseas to developing markets, they're putting cigarettes at eye levels of children because they know if they can get them addicted early, they put them 3 feet high. I don't know about you, but my eyes were not 3 feet high for a long time. And so they're putting them directly at the eye level of children so that they will try to buy them and snare them in addiction for a lifetime. They know that they can't derive as much profit from tobacco stateside, so they go overseas.
Right.
Same thing, we've talked about this with gambling, adult entertainment. These are industries that are doing their best to either enslave the person that is actually doing the entertainment or the gambling, or they're trying to enslave the user into continuing to want to engage in that behavior, which is oftentimes, it can be both damaging to you as an individual, but then it can also cause corporate harm.
Right.
We look at studies that have been done about tobacco and walls that are in buildings of homes of smokers being actually toxic for the next resident.
Yeah.
We look about alcohol and the disastrous effects of drinking and driving. We don't see this as solely an independent decision. This is also a communal decision of how is it affecting the body of the world around me. So we talked about the classic sin socks. Let's move over and talk about some other things that are more exploitation, injustice, human dignity. What are some of the areas that we think about screening there?
Well, one of the first ones is one of those areas that we became passionate about very early in kind of our entire journey, and that was there were certain companies that were engaging Sudan, paying them large sums of money for access to their mines and their precious metals and such. But the Sudanese government would take that and then turn it around on a subset of their own citizens via genocide. So we became aware of that and really were trying to stay away from a handful of different companies. There were a couple of Chinese companies, one Indian company, I think one Malaysian company that was engaging in this. And so we wanted to have a genocide-free portfolio. I think everybody really could kind of agree with that we talked with. But we look at that and say, okay, there are areas around the world where human rights are not held to the same standard as we see in the United States or in the West. So do we want to impose a screen so we're doing our best where a company is not using Uyghurs for slave labor, in Western China? There are other areas around the world. I think the coffee and the cocoa industry is doing better now, but at one point, a number of years ago, there's a lot of slavery in that supply chain in terms of harvesting the beans for those products. So really, it's sector by sector and company by company here in a lot of ways, but those that are overseas, particularly in the developing world, having a screen that looks at exploitation, injustice, that human dignity side of things can be really important. I think right alongside that, you would look at weapons manufacturers. And of course, this is a more contested arena there because there's some folks that say, well, I really think that it's important to have businesses that are helping the U.S. government or governments produce weapons to defend themselves. There's others that say, okay, I think that's antithetical to the gospel. I don't want to be profiting alongside that. But that would be another one of those areas. And sometimes we would even screen certain parts of that, but maybe not other parts. So if it was like cluster munitions or something like that, or any company that had to do with nuclear weapons, there are ways that some screens, screen out some companies in a given sector and not other companies based on what they're up to.
Right, absolutely. Well, and as we think moving from maybe one gray area in weapons, we'll enter another gray area of life and family issues. And I'll let you touch on the hard one. I'm going to take the climate issue. And I think the reality here is there is a whole litany of life and family issues that are important to Christians, whether that's creation care or upholding the value of the human family through avoiding abortion services. There is a whole lot of a spectrum of how do we engage this as a Christian. And just like you were saying, there are certain environmental screens that can go on that eliminate nuclear energy, where some other people may think, hey, nuclear energy is fine. But as we think about life and family issues, what are we concerned about here in terms of the screening process?
Well, I think you began to unpack, those different pieces. And this is one of those where we see Christians take different lines of thought here. But this would include anything related to conception and birth. So anything related to abortion, would be on one side. Anything related to euthanasia would be on the other side of things. So I know those are contentious issues, but certainly those that some people want to be able to screen out, from portfolios. Another piece would be those companies in terms of how they relate to human sexuality. There are some that are going to take particular views that may be antithetical to views of some Christians or other Christians. And so that's got to be, one of those areas also that's considered. How do you want to look at companies? Because there's a wide array of how companies engage in those arenas.
Right, absolutely. Well, and I think with all of that is, are you solely engaging in trying to screen out the product or how the company is engaging their donations and their corporate engagement in terms of philanthropy too? So super wide array. Not enough time to really dive into that here, but let's go ahead and move on to thinking about how do investment managers actually build screens. And so let's go ahead and first talk about the idea of negative screening, positive screening, and engagement. This is where negative screens are doing exactly what we talked about in the previous section, where we were saying, okay, you've got sin stocks. We're going to avoid sin stocks. So you create a list of companies where if their profit margins exceed an X value, that could be 1%, that could be 5%, that could be 20%. But you're saying if your profits derive from alcohol by more than 1%, 5%, 20%, you are excluded from the portfolio. That's what we think about negative screens. So let's walk through a little bit more on these revenue screens. If there's a 10% screen on one product, let's say it's on alcohol, does that mean there's a 10% screen on all products, or how does this work?
Well, not usually. Every provider is going to screen things in a little bit different way. So, for instance, DFA in their socially responsible screens might look at things a little bit differently than Eventide or Praxis or some other group that's out there. So every one of them has to really grapple with, where are we going to draw that line? Yeah. And it might be different for each one. So it would not be uncommon to see that you would have a much higher threshold in some areas than others. So you might have a threshold that would be up to 10% sales, that would be allowed for tobacco products without screening it out. Well, that would allow, companies like, Walmart and Kroger and maybe gas stations to have, to not be screened out by the tobacco screen. But on the other side of things, you might have something like, it has to be 5% or less of gambling, or 1% or less of, some other field there. So it's different, and every institution is going to approach a particular screen differently based on, again, core values and how they think about that. Because again, they might say, well, we really, our clientele really wants to avoid, for instance, weapons of mass destruction. So we're going to have a $0 threshold, on that screen. They might say we have a $0 threshold on genocide. If they engage in North Korea or Sudan or wherever it might be. That might be a $0 screen, whereas it might be much higher for things like tobacco or alcohol sales that are out there. And then you might have companies take different approaches for something like pornography. Some might take different screens even within their fund. So one of the things that we'll get to here in a moment is there can even be different screens if we're looking at separately managed accounts and we're looking at direct indexing type options, because you may have one provider that says, well, we have two options here. You either have a complete and total screen that gets rid of everything there, that there's $0, threshold, or it might be like 5% or 10%. So you can choose option A, option B, or we're not even going to screen that out at all. So this is where there's a lot of different pathways that you could go if you are invested in a separately managed account where you have individual stocks, or that direct indexing, again, where you have individual stocks.
Yeah. Well, and I think, this is where we have to say, you might have been a little bit uncomfortable if we said energy or tobacco or abortion or environment. Sometimes you are just going to get a blanket screen. And this is the fund. This is the screen that they place. That's what you get. You may say, I agree 100% with their screening on abortion, but I agree 0% with their screening on tobacco, or vice versa. And so when you look at these investment options, there are plenty of great investment ETFs, mutual funds that are out there. Our friends at Faith Driven Investor have lists of those that you can go and look and see who are those faith-based investment opportunities. We've mentioned Eventide, DFA, Praxis, some of these, but you're going to have to do your research. You might actually need to read the prospectus to see, hey, what are those screens? What are the thresholds? Who's deciding this? Do I agree with these people? At the end of the day, it's going to be complex. So let's go ahead and move into this idea of direct indexing, separately managed accounts. It's not for everybody because oftentimes separately managed accounts have very high minimums. But what is the benefit of direct indexing in separately managed accounts?
Well, it really is a choose your own adventure for a lot of these firms. Now, there's some that say, okay, well, we have an expertise in making investments in this particular sector or arena, and so they're going to have just a subset of offerings that are there. There may be some providers that say, well, we have such a strong opinion that we're not even really going to give you a choice on a handful of things here. There's a lot of providers that are out there, whether you look at Vident or DFA or some of the others that do these direct indexing or SMA type of accounts, that really it's a clean slate. You begin with, you can choose your own adventure there. So you could screen out the entire energy sector. You could screen out the entire energy sector, and you could say, okay, I don't like Monsanto. All kinds of different ways, that you could go there. So that tends to be much more granular, and those thresholds, like we talked about, you might not be able to set your own threshold, but they might have several options that you could choose within any sector or any screenable area, we'll just say.
Right. Well, and I think about, we've had conversations with DFA, with Biden, some of these providers, and they've said, the reality here is we're still getting data from some outside sources. And so that outside source may look at one issue and say, well, now it meets the threshold for that screen. And then you may look at your portfolio and say, well, I don't necessarily disagree with this. Why is this company getting screened in this? So you can get, just like you were saying, very, very granular. I want to eliminate this sector. I want to eliminate these issues. I want to eliminate these companies. But again, you're still at the mercy of other institutional data providers. And so the most granular that you can get is looking at that SMA and saying, okay, here's my list of 5,000 companies, 10,000 companies, saying no, yes, no, yes, no, yes. I don't think most investors are going to want to do that. And so I think the reality here is, as stewards, as we come back to this idea of what does it mean to be a steward, I will not make the perfect decision every single time. I will probably never make the perfect decision. The reality is, am I being faithful? And as I look at the parable of the talents and what the master calls, is he calls us to faithfulness. He doesn't call us to generate a 10x return. He doesn't call us to generate a 5x return. He doesn't even call us to generate a 2x return. He calls us to be faithful with the resources that he places in our hands. And so as stewards, as we look at, well, do I need to go with a mutual fund? Do I need to go with an ETF? Do I need to go completely picking and choosing the own stocks in my portfolio? Do I need to go direct index, separately managed account? The answer is maybe. But the bigger question is, how are you being faithful with the resources the master has placed in your hands?
Well, and it's that journey, that we talk about some. It's progress, not perfection.
Yeah.
There, you're not going to read every 10K, and you're not even going to know what they mean. Because none of us in particular sectors are going to know everything of what's even being unpacked there. So I think directionally, you want to take steps as best you can. Also with the reality that you're not going to spend 90 hours a week doing this stuff. So this is where I think we work to make sure that we have experts that we're working alongside, that we're trying to understand their core values, their belief system, and line clients up who would align with one particular company or another, one particular expert or another. So that we can get maybe 80% of the way there, 90% of the way there. Get directionally, again, moving along in a helpful and faithful and in a way that is good, but also recognize this side of heaven, there's going to be some gray, even when we get really, really granular.
Absolutely. Well, Spencer, thanks for talking us through just ideas of how do we actually start looking at creating a portfolio of biblically responsible investments. Clients, next time we're going to be talking about engaging as a shareholder. But if you want to have conversations with us about how do you actually create a portfolio that honors the Lord, that honors the desires that He has put in your heart, we would love to have that conversation with you and explore all the options that you have. Until next time, take care. If you found this episode valuable, share it with a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so that you don't miss the next episode.
This content was provided by Second Half Stewardship. We are in Knoxville, Tennessee, and you can visit our website at www.secondhalfstewardship.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents.